Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of Positionality Podcast. I am Rinzin Sonam, your host. In this episode, we will be discussing why Tibetans should be for Black Lives Matter. Today's guest is a special friend of mine, Tsepa, who was very generous to be willing to have this conversation with me. Tsepa currently lives in Boston and was originally from India. Hi, Tsepa.
Hi, Rinzi. How you doing?
Good. Tsepa, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Tsepa. I'm really excited to be on the show. Teshle Sangalo. Um, I, like many Tibetans, born in India, moved to the States when I was very young, and since then have been, participating in our community here in Boston, as well as a lot of the political activism that goes around being part of, not just being part of Tibetan, but being part of someone who feels, what's happening in Tibet is wrong, but also kind of now, seeing what's happening in our streets with Black Lives Matter and, feeling this really strong kind of need to mobilize our communities. Yeah.
And I also know you're one of the handlers for the Tibetans for Black Lives Matter, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a small group of us, we're a collective of mostly, young Tibetans in our 20s and 30s who felt like we need to have some kind of network of Tibetans and to, play our part in what we feel is a very important movement that's happening in America, but also beyond.
You guys can follow that on Instagram or on Facebook. So Tiba, I guess my first question to you is like, what was your first experience with racism growing up? And can you remember a time where Blackness was looked down upon and whiteness was elevated, especially in the Tibetan community?
Yeah, absolutely. So my experience has been a little bit different in that I grew up in so many different places. At first growing up in Kalimpong in India, there's that, right? And in India, it's a little, there's certainly anti-blackness, but there's a lot about like being against dark-skinned, right? And this kind of putting anybody who is white on this pedestal of being good, kind, generous, etc., and good looking too, right? you
Yeah,
know, you constantly see, even just anyone, as long as you're white, oh my God, you're so beautiful, right? And that's what I grew up in, and lots of so yeah, like I mean, I think if I'm trying to figure out like where to take this conversation, right? Because it was really interesting when you talk about anti-blackness in the Tibetan community, because most Tibetans, when I was growing up, had never met a black person, right? So how can they be anti-black?
right.
So and that's kind of where like you know for me growing up, there was a lot of, and some of it was kind of minor, like for example, my younger brother, Olo, was a lot more light skinned, so even as a child, like 7, 8 years old, I knew that I was treated a different way, and adults would do it without even thinking about it, invite him or give him a candy and then kind of look at me and be like, what the hell are you doing there? But I knew it, deep down, I understood what being darker meant. And again, like, for someone like me, it's very different because, I was privileged, in so many ways, even in our current refugee situation. So when you think about anti-blackness, to me, it's sadly impressive that people who have never met a black person is anti-black, and I've seen that in my community and, close friends and family. So I think it goes to showing how deeply ingrained this opinion is, right? And how it's systemic, it crosses borders, and it's kind of actively exported and imported,
Right.
And in India, going back to India, I know I'm jumping back and forth, it's pretty clear, right? What type of hue of your skin is cherished, right? You see all the fairness creams, and constantly reminding you that being light skinned is good and being dark skinned is bad. Again,
Oh yeah.
it's not as simple as that. There are people who are working really hard to dismantle that, but generally speaking, you turn the TV on even today, you'll see that.
for sure. I mean, I can relate. Like when I was in India, there was every commercial was fair and lovely and lightening your skin, and the lighter skinned girl got the part in the play that I wanted, and it's just the teachers treat you different. So in a childhood minds, it's better to be white because you have more opportunities. And of
Right.
course, yeah, that's a result of colonialization in India and just many different things, not even in India, but in Asia. But yeah, for sure.
And to
Um,
add, to that, I always think about like these are, you have your examples, I have mine, and Black people have many, but there's so many of that, we know it, but we can't prove it, and that's like, I feel like how insidious racism and anti-Blackness and this kind of discrimination against people with darker skin, Black and brown people is, right? Because we have to really find these perfect examples, but knowing like from our experiences, there's so many cases, we know it in the heart of our hearts, but we just can't show it.
yeah, for sure. Um, this kind of leads to I know on the Black Lives Matters page on Instagram, there's a post about how we talk to our Tibetan parents, and on one of the section it says, some parents, not all, I'm obviously generalizing, that they feel that all minorities have equal opportunities to thrive in America because the America is land of dream, and we all come here with nothing.
Mhm.
But obviously I have my own opinion, but based on this, what are some privilege you notice as an Asian man compared to your Black friends in America?
Sure. Yeah. So when I moved to America in '96, I was 10 years old, and I was in a school where they had a bilingual program and a regular ed, right,
Okay.
program.
Hmm.
So my classmates were from all over the world, right? From Ghana, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Yugoslavia, China, Nepal, Tibet, like you name it, right? Um, but and we all face stereotypes, but they were different, right? For me, people thought I knew karate and I was good at math, and you'd be surprised how deeply they believe this, especially in the mid and late '90s. It's it's hilarious, right? But it's also like really messed up, right? You don't even know me, but you assume these things,
Right,
and I think a lot of the kind of stereotypes that I faced was around trying to be this model minority Asian, right?
right. To
And people
step
liked me until I had an opinion, right? Whereas I think some of my Black friends, I think it was different because there was a fear of Blackness, right? There was this like unjustified fear of violence from being Black, from a
right,
Black man, right? From a Black woman. So yeah, and I think in that sense, it's sometimes it's hard to be Tibetan and have lost a country and have lost so many lives as part of a military occupation of our country
hmm,
to understand that in some ways we are privileged, right? And this is why I think white privilege is so difficult for some white people to understand, because they're poor, they feel like they've made their own life, but while that's true, it's also not a even playing field. You can't compare someone who is poor and white and kind of struggling to make it happen
hmm,
to someone like Michael Jordan. Like it's not apples to apples. So yeah, so absolutely,
yeah,
there is privilege, there are stereotypes while they're different, but generally speaking, I think based on my experiences growing up in America, um, I would take, and this is sad, I would take the stereotypes I got against the ones that my Black friends got any given day. And I know that's selfish of me, but that's the truth, and that's where we have to ask ourselves, like, shit, we are part of this and we need to do something about it.
right. For me, I know that as an Asian woman, I don't ever have to leave my house and be scared that a cop is gonna kill me. I don't have to think about that. I actually think of it as like if I'm gonna go somewhere, the cop's gonna, they're gonna help me. And that's my privilege right there. And this time of anti-blackness, the crisis of that, I've been really critiquing myself on that and how my Black friends feel
Mm.
when they leave their house. So talking about privilege as an Asian person, Tao Tao is the Asian officer who was at the scene during the killing of George Floyd. What was your initial reaction when you learned that he was an Asian man?
Um, as an Asian American immigrant, obviously that is something, that's difficult to see. But also, I think it reminds us that, it's racism and anti-blackness isn't as clear cut. And I think for us as Asians in particular, symbolized by this police officer, I think, us not stepping in, us standing by, or us, being some kind of enabler,
Mm-hmm.
a quiet one or a more of a active one, is also part of the system, right? That creates this, social economic gap, right? Gap in justice, right? When you look at the police brutality against Black people, the mass incarceration, um, you know, it shows us that while we have, a difficult time, especially as Tibetans, we don't have, we're not here and surrounded by people who have been raised, under 400 years of a system, right? That's still propagated, right? So I think we have to kind of understand that and see that. And, when you see someone like George Floyd, being killed by a police officer for allegedly using a fake $20 bill, Breonna Taylor being killed in her sleep,
Right.
Ahmaud Arbery for jogging, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, by a white supremacist. Tamir Rice, 12-year-old boy with a toy gun being shot down by police. Philando Castile, the traffic stop, right? So many traffic stops we've heard of. So, I think all of this is, I think, a reminder that while oppression isn't something that we can compare, sometimes people go into this type of, like, as my friend would always say, this type of oppression Olympics, saying like, hey, my life is worse, my life is worse. I think we need to understand that in America, this type of oppression against Black people and anti-Blackness runs many, many, many generations deep. And I think it's a moment for all of us. Yes, white people, absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
but also as Asian Americans, I think it's good to understand that it is different for us in America. And, for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, we don't see this type of violence against our community, and this type of police brutality, this type of mass incarceration, that is so obvious, right? You don't have to read much to see how bad it is, right? I encourage people to Google police brutality, mass incarceration, and look at some of the numbers of Black people being targeted.
Right. And I totally agree with you that we shouldn't compare oppression. I think that defeats the whole purpose of Black Lives Matter and goes for all lives matter. So I think you brought up a really good point.
Right, exactly. It's this kind of like, oh yeah, all lives matter. Yeah. And this is obviously, I don't know why we even talk about this, right? And to your point, it's we need to understand that what's happening in America is really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
We all have our challenges, but I think many of us in this case also we're coming in with a lot of privilege that Black people in America don't have. So I think it's okay to say, look, yes, there are other issues, but this is a really, really big one that we need to talk about.
Right.
And I think this gets tricky, especially in our community, I think. And I think sometimes in our work, your work, Rinzin, like my work, and so many other people who are trying to do the right thing, I think sometimes it's hard, right? Because, we all stumble. And I'm sure, you and I probably said something that some people didn't like, right? Because we're all learning, right? But I think it's, we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. We should continue to do the work. At least that's the kind of advice I'd give myself, that people will show us a better way sometimes, and that's okay. But not to let that be a kind of a crippling feeling. Sometimes it's good to feel bad. Some people, that benefit out of the system deserve to feel a little bit bad.
Of
Um,
course.
but again, The idea being, there's so many ways to help, and we should all participate.
Yes. And I think you touched a little bit on this, but I know, as coming from Tibet and our history and the oppressions our ancestors faced and still today, and the genocide and just so much sadness and grief, how can you relate this feeling to the anti-Black crisis and the police violence in America today?
So, as many folks know, and some people may not, that Tibet is an occupied nation um, since 1959, and China's military occupation led to over 1 million lives, Tibetan lives, according to the Central Tibetan Administration, right? And my parents and my grandparents left everything that they had and literally walked over the Himalayas. Right?
My parents did too, yeah. That's
Exactly, right. And this is the story of so many Tibetans, right? Just so that we didn't become part of that 1 million, and I believe exactly it's 1.2 million lives, right? We to avoid being a statistic in there of 1.2 million Tibetans' lives lost, my grandparents and parents fled Tibet, you know, and that's a big part of why I work in within the Tibetan freedom movement with various communities, right? Through the Boston Tibetan community, through Students for Free Tibet, where I worked for 3 years in New York City, through the Boston Tibet Vigil. And in doing all this work, it helped me understand how oppression works and how resistance can work. Having seen some of the work that we've been able to do for Tibetan freedom movements, right? So it helps me understand, not fully. I never will. I don't have to be Black and walk down the street or drive a car and a minor offense leading to me being shot or killed by the police, or being called up, police being called on me for loitering. All of these privileges, right? But I do think even though individual or groups of oppressors, while they can be powerful, they're also not so creative, right? You see the same tactics being used, right? So I totally relate to the way the Black Lives Matter movement is being portrayed today, to how China and the Chinese Communist Party portrayed Tibetan resistance. So if for folks who remember 2008, when Tibetans rose up, and this was overwhelmingly nonviolent, right? But the state media in China, all they showed were, these instances of Tibetans, rioting, or breaking, harming property or throwing rocks, right?
right.
Sure, like I'm sure that happened,
Mhm.
but to choose to show the 1% or the 2% and not to show the overwhelming movement, is a way to brainwash your people, right? And today I see that in how the movement to provide equity and justice to our Black community is being undermined by showing constantly, examples of, let's say, a store being looted, right?
Mhm.
Instead of focusing on the larger picture of something that is not an outlier, but something that is systemic and actively held in our community here in America for the last 400 years.
Mhm. Right. And Tiba, I wanted to go back on when you said about the propaganda, how the Chinese government used little bit of the violent section probably we had as the main coverage. And I want to talk about the power, who has the power to control the media. I mean, if you look at today, a lot of people who are in power are white, and they're able to show what, they're able to make the decisions, and that's what systemic is. The ones that have the power to control within education, housing, with anything around that area.
Mm-hmm.
um but yeah, I just thought it was interesting, and I think, thank God for social media, that we have the control over what to post and to share contents with other people. And I think for me, that's really what's helping with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where, like, and you and I know this as Tibetans, right? What's happening in Tibet and China is not it's not the same, right? While it's oppression is oppression is oppression, it's different, right? And there's a lot of context to it. And in China, where they're able to block social media, in America, you know, although it's a troubled democracy, it is still a democracy today, right? That disenfranchises Black and brown people. But we have been able to use social media to really spotlight what has been happening and what the Black communities have been telling us forever, you know? But it's taking these videos for us to go, aha, okay, you were telling the truth, you
Right.
know?
Mm-hmm. For sure.
That's sad. That's so sad. Can you imagine how sad that is? Like, for kind of centuries trying to tell people what's happening, but no one believing you,
Of course.
you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Mm-hmm. And some people are so brainwashed into thinking that those definitely doesn't exist. I mean, on both sides, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think you brought up a good point also about talking about, trying to draw this comparison, because I think, when we talk about systemic in America, right, there's a history of how Black people are treated, right? So when you come in as, like, for example, like my grandparents, like my grandmother, who's now no longer with us, when she came to America for the first time, she met Black people and she immediately said, they're not good.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't think she is a racist. I think the power dynamics are different. She is this harmless Tibetan woman who lost her country, lived in a small village her entire life, never met a Black person, already thinks Black people are bad,
Yeah.
right? I don't see her as being the racist that I would say, like, if you are a white person who has been benefiting from the system,
Mm-hmm.
right, that's been actively upheld for all of these years, all these generations, right, and you hold these beliefs and hold Black and brown communities down, you know, and you believe that you are better because of the color of your skin, then that power dynamic also has to exist to be a racist. You know what I mean? So I think there's a lot of work in our community, but I also think it's very different when we are trying to talk to our parents, our grandparents, or our communities who themselves have come through trauma,
Mm-hmm.
right? Who themselves are trying to understand what happened to them, who themselves have this feeling that they need to, as refugees, we need to impress our host nations, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of why I feel, and we feel at, with T4BL, that it's got to be Tibetans who, provide education materials and to mobilize our communities, because we have the nuanced understanding of how to talk to our people because of the trauma that we've been through.
Mm-hmm. For sure. This just brought up something. I remember talking to a close friend of mine. She's Tibetan, and she was telling me how in her household, her parents have always told her never to talk to a Black person because they're violent, and don't get involved in the Black Lives Matter movement because it will bring her trouble. And she told me that during lunch or something, she would never sit with the Black person, not because she hates them, but because like what her parents have been telling her. And when she went to college, it changed for her because she started learning and talking, and she realized how, wrong her parents were. And I think for her, it was the realization, going to college and like actually making the first step, talking to a Black person and like having a genuine conversation with them. And yeah, I just wanted to share that story because I remember from what you just said.
Yeah,
um
I'm sure, like, if you share this with a lot of, Tibetan families, I think they'll relate to that story. It's not a one-off, right? It's a story that, you experience, that I can relate to, and I'm sure many Tibetans and other immigrant communities can relate to. And that's so sad
mhm,
that this kind of anti-blackness is so prevalent in all communities.
right. We're running out of time, but I'll just ask you two question merge into one. So, I mean, obviously, you're very involved with the Black Lives Matter, and you want to do things. You're taking a stand, and you're not neutral about it. Well, why do you think it's important to take a side rather than stay silent and neutral about the situation? And how do you think your background has influenced you to take a stand? I mean, I know you talked a little bit, but just in a quick one,
Sure.
two. acceptance?
Sure. So for me, you know, it's very simple, and I don't see how people don't see it, right? It confuses me and infuriates me that it's not as obvious as it should be, right? So, and I encourage everyone to watch this documentary called 13th on Netflix. You know, there's a statistics that they share that, you know, the U.S. Black population is around 6%, right? But 40% of our prison population is Black, right? So if you just think about that statistic, right? 6% make up so the American population is made up of 6% of Black people. What 40% of the prison population is Black, right? Slavery ended 150 years ago.
Mm.
What's the problem, right? And I think if when we're trying to have this conversation, if someone believes, if I have this conversation with someone, and let's say, he believes that racism is bad, you shouldn't be judged by the color of your skin, then we need to address this statistic, and it's one of many, right? But if you believe that Black people are inherently not good or violent, then we need to have a different conversation. And that's where I would call you a racist, and you would be wrong, and it's a different conversation. But if you are someone who believes that you shouldn't be judged by the color of your skin, and the color of your skin doesn't dictate who you are and what you do,
Mhm.
then we need to address the statistic, right?
Right.
Because how do you explain the fact that slavery ended 150 years ago? Everything is supposedly equal, but we have imprisoned the Black population like no one else. um, I think Native Americans would unfortunately kind of be part of this type of systemic oppression that's happened in America. But now, since we're talking about Black lives, how do you explain that statistic? And I think trying to answer that question goes into all the policies that are actively holding the Black community down and providing and giving privilege to white communities.
Mm-hmm. For sure. What did you say the name of the Netflix was?
13th by Ava DuVernay. It was Academy. I never can tell the difference between Academy or Grammy, but I think it was an Academy Award nominee.
Okay.
Uh, and it's on Netflix, so I highly recommend folks to watch. I certainly learned a lot, even though I grew up in America and I went through U.S. history. Mainstream U.S. history talks about slavery, but again, it doesn't try to explain the statistic that I'm talking about, because it just says this happened and it ended. But
Mm-hmm.
what happened? What really happened after that, right? Jim Crow happened, but
Right.
even Jim Crow's gone. So what's happening today, right? I may not be able to show you on paper, but the reality is in front of our faces.
Definitely. It's still very relevant today. Um, and lastly, can you tell us a bit about what the Tibetans for Black Matters have done, and what can Tibetans do to contribute to the Black Lives Matter? Folks who don't know what to do, folks who wants to do something but have no idea what resource or what actions to take.
Sure, absolutely. None of us at T4BL are experts.
Mm-hmm.
We want to do good. We're trying to do good. We're listening. We're listening to the Black community. We're listening to figure out how we can help. We are educating ourselves. We're sometimes stumbling, but we're not letting that hold us down, because we think this work is important.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're doing things, we're learning, we're listening, we're changing. And so I would say I encourage folks to do things like watch this documentary. It starts with, educating ourselves and unlearning a lot of things that we have acquired through our years. And then I would say, there is the portion of mobilization. There's so many things we can do. For us, as a collective, our focus is on our communities, because that's where we feel um, we have influence over. That's where we feel we are the right people to talk to our communities.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are trying to figure out how to help, I would say follow us on social media. And I only say that because we put out a lot of material that's translated that might be helpful for older Tibetans or for Tibetans who primarily speak and read Tibetan. I would say fundraise, you know,
Mhm.
um, as someone who worked at Students for Free Tibet as a small nonprofit organization, I know that one of the best things to do is to fund the work that the experts are already doing, right? There are people working on the grounds who know what to do, how to do. We want to make sure, not just now, right now there's a wave of donations coming in, but to sustain this movement through funding. So there's so many ways to do things. I would say, don't be worried about making a mistake. But when you do, I think it's good to learn from it and adapt, but don't let the fear of making mistakes do something for Black lives, because there's something that all of us can do. And especially as Tibetans, I think, it puts us in a very, in a situation where we can, understand a little bit better than most people because of our history, and maybe even empathize to a level that maybe some others can't, unfortunately.
Right, and you bring up great points. For folks who wants to take baby steps, I think, checking on your Black friends, see how they're doing. This is a lot of stress for them, and I can't imagine what some people are going through. So check on your friends and make sure they're doing okay, and even just be their ally. Go to protest, make signs, or take baby steps like that. But on that
Yeah.
note, we're almost at the end of our time. Just wanted to thank you, Tiba. Cheyang and I are very grateful for having you on and you being our first guest on our Positionality podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you.